Well, thank you, Condi. Madam Secretary, thank you so much for being here this evening. It is a great privilege and an honor to have you with us this evening. Let's start with your relationship with Madeleine. Your paths crossed many times over many years. Tell us about your relationship. Tell us about what she meant to you.
Well, Dean, thank you so much. And to you and the Chancellor and Provost and everyone gathered, it is such a delight to be here at the university on behalf of this special occasion that is remembering and honoring Madeleine Albright. As you heard from Condi Rice, both she and I had the great advantage of following Madeleine because we could see what she did when she broke that glass ceiling, becoming our first woman Secretary of State. But my friendship with Madeleine goes back many years before that. I started hearing about Madeleine Albright in political campaigns, like the one that she was working on in 1988 that she called Condi about, which I think was a surprise to both of them. And I was so excited when I learned that she had gone to Wellesley. We're both Wellesley College graduates, and that she was interested in policy and politics, as was I. So when Bill was elected president in 1992 and was starting to go through lists of people to include in the new administration, Madeleine's name was prominent on a number of those lists. And Bill invited her to come to Arkansas. And although she was, someone who we had met, we knew about, we hadn't spent a lot of time with her. But I have to say it was truly friendship at first sight because her warmth, her intelligence, her sense of humor, she just immediately connected with us, and we felt exactly the same way. So when Bill asked her to be the ambassador to the United Nations, she and I had a lot of common interests in foreign policy and certainly spent many hours talking about the role that she then was fulfilling. She had me come to New York on several occasions to do events at the United Nations. She hosted a memorable dinner for me in the ambassador's apartment in New York. And we just became closer and closer in terms of our understanding one another, respecting one another. And it really culminated in an opportunity that Bill had to appoint a new Secretary of State. When his first appointment, Warren Christopher, retired, resigned, left the office. So Bill had to come up with a new Secretary of State. And it will not surprise you, particularly those of you at the Korbel School, that there was a lot of competition for that. A lot of people who thought they should be Secretary of State and who were running campaigns and putting their names out there and giving tidbits to the press and the like. And I thought it should be Madeleine Albright. I thought she had done a really good job at the UN. I thought her values were really in line with Bill's. From the very beginning, in part because of her own background, she understood the danger posed by the war in the Balkans and the aggression that was taking place there. In terms of the impact on the entire region. She really had an astute understanding of the changes that were happening in what we used to back then call the post-Cold War world. And so I was a strong advocate of Madeleine's nomination to become Secretary of State. And luckily, My husband agreed. So she became our first woman Secretary of State.
That was fantastic. Well, as you heard briefly in the video, she was the first but not the last. Talk to us about how important she has been, how important she was for all the women who followed after, the doors she opened, her influence on the next generation.
Well, it's a really important question, and there are many strands to the answer, Fritz, because number one, she became a role model. She became someone who took a position that since the beginning of our country had never been held by a woman. That meant she was under a lot of extra scrutiny and people trying to, figure out how she would do and whether she was up to the job and, the kinds of things you hear people muse about when a woman first takes a position that hasn't been filled by a woman before. And she, more than met all expectations. Because of her presence, because of the way she conducted herself and presented her arguments. She was a really formidable debater. She had great one-liners. She could put people in their place. She would sometimes, say things that were, by some standards perhaps, impolite or impolitic, but they made the point. And so I think it wasn't just women, it was women and men, young women and men, who saw a Secretary of State who was down to earth, who communicated really effectively. And I think for a lot of young women interested in public service or certainly interested in international relations or diplomacy, it was such a reassuring sight to see her representing our country. So that was one aspect. But there was a second piece of this, which was very important to me personally, and that is, once she became Secretary of State, she and I spent a lot of time talking about what we could do to elevate the roles of women in American foreign policy. And she was a great partner in that. We worked together to found a group with someone that is from Denver, Swanee Hunt, who was an ambassador at that time to Austria, to found a group called Vital Voices, which was originally aimed at literally giving voice to women who had been in countries in the former Soviet Union. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, an effort to, try to create democracies, try to get economies going. It was a, very challenging time, and there were a lot of women who wanted to play a role, but had no experience in, what does it mean to be a leader in a democracy or in a free society? How do you start a business? Whatever their interest was. So we started this group, Vital Voices. It was originally housed at the State Department. And it was an important statement about how we wanted to institutionalize looking at women's participation in society as a major part of foreign policy. Half the world, it's hard to imagine democracy succeeding without women having a role. So that was another big thing. Then finally, Madeleine headed the delegation to the Beijing conference in 1995. She was still at the United Nations then, but she was asked by Bill to head a delegation, which in those days was bipartisan, women and men, going to a United Nations conference about women. I mean, you can't even imagine that today. And so Madeleine was with me every step of the way when I was asked to speak there. There was a lot of controversy about whether I should go or shouldn't go. The Chinese, right before the conference, picked up a Chinese-American citizen who they threw in jail for human rights advocacy work. There were a lot of people in Congress, people in the State Department, people in the White House who didn't want me to go and certainly not speak there. And Madeleine was my advocate, my champion throughout all of that. And she was at one of her daughter's weddings right before we had to fly to Beijing, and Alice, who you'll hear from in a minute, will remember this. Literally, Madeleine had to leave the wedding reception to get on an airplane to meet me in Hawaii to fly to Guam to fly to Beijing, and she never missed a step. I think she might have even been still wearing her mother of the bride outfit when she got on the plane. But so in many ways, her breaking that glass ceiling was not just for her. It was really not just an inspiration and representation. She worked to institutionalize what it meant to include women's voices and women's participation in foreign policy, in diplomacy, in every walk of life. And that was an incredible contribution.
Will we follow up on? Of course, at that conference in Beijing, you gave what is quite a famous speech in which you said human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. Apparently a novel idea at the time. I'm curious, and obviously you and Madeleine were very much aligned in that regard. If you look at the world today, nearly 30 years later, where are we today in recognizing women's rights?
Well, we are backsliding, and there's enormous pushback. And to go back to the Beijing conference for just 1 minute, just as a additional note about that, yes, I gave the speech, and I meant to, as Madeleine and I talked about on the plane to Beijing, push the envelope as far as I could. And it should not have been a novel concept, but it was greeted as a novel concept because there were still a lot of doubts about whether women's rights were the same as human rights, if you can believe that. But the significant outcome of the conference was something called a platform for action. It was adopted by consensus by every country represented there, and there were about 189 countries and jurisdictions. It was negotiated hard. It included economic rights, social rights, reproductive rights, governmental rights. It included the full range of women's rights, and it included, a lot of ideas about how to move the debate forward. I'll give you another Madeleine example. So one of the things that it said was that domestic violence was a crime. Because until that was actually said and adopted, domestic violence was viewed as, quote, cultural. And it was Madeleine Albright who said, domestic violence is not cultural, it is criminal. And yet very few countries had any laws against domestic violence. That's just one example of many that I could give you about what we were attempting to do, which was to equalize treatment under the law, to equalize rights of inheritance, rights to property, rights to vote, rights to drive a car, rights to get an education, rights to have access to the full range of healthcare, and on it went. So this platform for action was adopted, and one of the things that Madeleine and I worked on for the rest of the Clinton administration was going around the world implementing it. And we had pieces of, efforts that were focused at helping to change laws in countries, helping to raise visibility about problems like trafficking, creating more of a global consensus about the need to improve the options and the opportunities, the treatment of women as we tried to move toward full participation and equality. So I think it's fair to say that it would be very difficult to get consensus today on that same document. And part of what's happened, it's very troubling, is that political leaders have arisen in many parts of the world who are explicitly calling for women's rights to be turned back. Now, we know in this country, obviously, the Supreme Court's decision in the Dobbs case, but there are many examples where there's a cultural pressure that is combined with political leadership demands to, have women be producing more children, for example, have women be, not given equal access to employment as a right. In Russia, in the last several years, after having passed laws against domestic violence, they began to pull them back. So you could literally go country by country, and in many, many places, you can see that. This pushback has, to some extent, I think, been both catalyzed by and certainly amplified by social media, which is a delivery system of misogyny around the world and aimed particularly at women of any position or visibility, not just in politics and other aspects of society or the economy, but any woman who is viewed as outspoken, as standing up for women's rights, taking a position that might otherwise have been viewed as a man's, all of that. And so the combination of a kind of turn the clock back attitude in many places about women's agency, women's autonomy, women's rights is aided and abetted by what we see online. And just a quick story is that I have been shocked in the last several years to talk to women in a number of countries, including our own, but elsewhere, who are in public life. They're in government, either as elected or official, mostly elected, not just appointed. And the amount of threats that they face. I was in England recently, where some of you might remember a young woman parliamentarian named Jo Cox, who was against Brexit, was literally killed at a speech against, why she thought they should not leave the European Union. And somebody all, agitated about Brexit and what it meant, killed her. So when I was in England last summer meeting with a group of women elected officials, all they wanted to talk about was personal security. I never used to hear that. But the threats that they receive online, and not just to them, but to their families, from both lone wolf kind of characters as well as organized efforts at pushback, go away, get off the stage, quit speaking out. We don't want to hear from you anymore. I mean, it's kind of familiar sounding to me. So it's like, but it's applied not just to somebody like me who's, got a pretty high profile, but just people who are in city councils, people who are on library boards who don't like the books that are being banned, people who are just out there, women who are trying to do their work. It doesn't even have to be paid work. It can be volunteer work about what kinds of, programs to have in the schools or at the libraries. Pushback. So yeah, it's a very, it's a very real phenomenon.
It's a very troubling phenomenon. Let me turn to another troubling phenomenon, another area in which we see backsliding, and another area in which you and Secretary Albright really aligned. She was, as you well know, fierce defender of democracy, who saw both its preciousness and its fragility. And in her penultimate book, I guess, Fascism, A Warning, she saw, perhaps sooner than others, the danger of rising authoritarianism. So there are a lot of ways we could go with this, but a question is, why does protecting democracy around the world matter? Why should it matter to us in the United States?
Well, how much time do you have?
We got a while.
If you have not read Madeleine's book, Fascism, A Warning, I really encourage you to do so, because she writes from the perspective of someone who, with her family, first fled Nazi invasions in Europe into Czechoslovakia, which was her home country, returning after the war only to flee from Soviet communism. So she lived a life that had a first-hand understanding of what it meant to be up against forces and leaders who wanted to control every aspect of society and who would decide who was worth including and belonging and who wasn't. And her book is a very clear description because, you wonder yourself. I mean, I used to as a young woman, and I would, be in history class or something, I'd see newsreel footage of Mussolini or Hitler. And I thought, who would listen to those people? They look ridiculous. I mean, I didn't speak Italian or German, but just up there flailing away and doing what they were doing. Why would anybody be influenced by that? Oh, well, And so what she saw was that the roots of this kind of authoritarian mentality, this strong man approach to governing, was sadly not eliminated with the end of World War II. But it was alive and well in many parts of the world, no matter what people described themselves as. So you could, I think, fairly look at Putin and say, certainly authoritarian, probably fascist, certainly corrupt, certainly controlling, everything that we have seen very, very clearly in the last year. You could look at Viktor Orban, won an election, immediately began to stamp out a free press, stamp out a political opposition, get rid of intellectuals, get rid of the, Central European University that was based in Budapest, because who wants all those, professors and curious students around asking, difficult questions, and dubbing what he was doing as illiberal democracy. It's so Orwellian. Whatever that means, that's what he's trying to do. And even with Xi Jinping, and we think of that as being, a Chinese Communist Party state, but there used to be, in their own way, a form of politics and a form of leadership transition, an agreement that, okay, first we'll have you and you'll serve for 7 years, and then we'll decide who follows you, and you'll serve for 7 years, and then we'll go on to somebody else. And then she says, no, I'm not leaving. I'm taking control. I am going to be the leader for as long as I want to be the leader. And I'm actually going to humiliate the prior leader, Hu Jintao, in public to send a message that this is it. I'm here to stay. And whenever a leader decides to stay for life, that's a problem. So when we look at backsliding in democracy around the world, it's not like people in this country with those tendencies aren't paying attention. Why have they invited? Why has the Republican Party, the right wing, the groups that are part of their coalition invited Viktor Orban to come and address them? Because they like what he's doing. They like him suppressing the press. They like him subverting the judiciary. They like him making it difficult for opposition parties to compete. They even kind of like his picking of enemies, whether they're immigrants or George Soros, so they invite him and he comes and he gives them a full dose, and they kind of feel a sense of, kinship with these other countries. It's very important to recognize too that Putin has been subverting democracy for quite some time, not just the 2016 election, which, I'll mention but not go into. But they've subverted elections in other places in Europe. They have suborned politicians. They have funded parties. I don't know if you remember the picture of Marine Le Pen, the main opponent in France, going off to meet with Putin in Moscow, and we now know coming back with a lot of cash for her party. And it's one of the reasons I think in the end Macron beat her this last time, because he had a great line in a debate when he said, well, yeah, what does your banker Putin think? I mean, because Putin has been currying favor, intimidating people, using oligarchs' money to buy media, doing a lot to continue his campaign against democracy and against the West. So in our own country, a number of people were paying attention, including, of course, the former president. who I no longer really like to refer to as the former president or even a presidential nominee. I like to refer to him as the cult leader. Because what he did, like a smart demagogue does, is to pick up on all these strains of prejudice and bias and insecurity and fear and hate, and weave them together into a message like, you know what, you and I, we really understand each other. I hate all the people you hate. And you know what? I'm going to get even for you. We're going to figure this out because, otherwise there's carnage in the streets. I mean, how bizarre was that campaign and how bizarre was that inauguration? But that was straight out of the fascist playbook. And now he's even more enraged because he lost. And he couldn't believe he lost because he wasn't supposed to lose, because all of his allies were supposed to make sure he won the Electoral College, even if he lost the popular vote by a greater margin than he lost to me. And so this is the kind of, this is the kind of mentality that leads to authoritarianism and leads to certainly fascistic tendencies, right? There's a debate, I'm sure you all debate this here at the Korbel School. Is it really fascism? Is it just good old authoritarianism? Is it leaching into totalitarianism? I don't know. I'm just watching it happen. And I'm watching people form coalitions between financial interests, partisan political interests, religious interests, ideological interests, all together, literally trying to push the clock back on how we live together. And whether we understand we're stronger because we are a diverse country. And we shouldn't be in a zero-sum game. We should be figuring out how to lift everybody up. Everybody. I don't care who you are, where you are, what you do, everybody. And, that is not the prevailing political view, unfortunately, now of, one of our major parties and leaders of it.
We could pursue that further, probably. I'd probably be remiss if I didn't ask you about, you were talking about Russia and Putin, about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As you know, Madeleine's last op-ed, published on the eve of war, in the New York Times, entitled "Putin is Making an Historic Mistake," remarkably prescient. Predicted much of what happened. She saw that in that article, and I think, again, you shared this view that this war, this aggression was not just about what's happening, in Ukraine, tragic as that is, but that it was a challenge to democracy and to the rule of law in the international arena. Is that how you see it as well?
Absolutely. Look, Madeleine and I really shared a similar view of Putin's ambitions. I had no argument with people who hope for the best from Putin. And there were areas that I negotiated with him on when I was Secretary of State that were important to us, a New START treaty, for example, on the numbers of nuclear weapons and how we monitored each other's stockpiles. The Iran sanctions, which I negotiated, that we ended up being able to get through the Security Council. There were things that we did have an interest in trying to reach agreement with. But I never doubted for a minute that he wanted to not just consolidate rule over Russia, but begin through either intimidation or co-option to reconstruct his near abroad, his neighborhood, to be much more in line with and obedient to Russia's interests and Russia's views. I didn't know whether that was just mostly because of who he was and the fact that as a former KGB agent, he saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, as he said, as one of the greatest catastrophes in world history, or whether it was kind of the tendency of Russian leaders to, feel like, my gosh, they have this huge landmass, let's do more with it. I never really, I have lots of stories about him we don't have time for that in my encounters with him, but I never doubted that his goal was to do everything he could to expand Russian influence and literally control. So when he invaded Georgia in 2008, the end of the Bush administration, you know, people did not want to see that for what it was. I mean, there was a lot of talk like, well, you know, Saakashvili, who was then the president, is kind of a difficult guy. And, you know, he kind of walked into the trap. It happened. Oh, you know, we don't know what to do. I mean, we sanctioned, we rhetorically, you know, said he shouldn't have done it, all that. But he seized 2 sections of a sovereign country on his border. Okay. Then I was in Ukraine in 2013. I had left Secretary of State. I was going to speak there. And Ukraine was on a path to requesting EU membership. Not NATO, because that was still highly controversial, but EU. And the young people of Ukraine, after, you know, pouring into the streets, after, you know, expressing themselves, that it wasn't that they wanted to turn their backs on Russia. They also wanted to be able to move toward Europe. I mean, they were so strategically located, and they wanted the benefits of both East and West together. So when I actually was in Crimea in 2013 at a conference, and there was so much enthusiasm. And then I started talking to some of the people who were there, and they were sympathetic to this idea of moving toward the EU. But they were telling me that, you know, Putin is making it very clear that bad things will happen if we move toward the EU. And we don't know what to do. And of course, you know, I was no longer in office, but I was deeply concerned about that. And lo and behold, you know, the next year he invades, seizes Crimea, seizes, you know, the Donetsk, and basically begins the war then. The thing that the press doesn't cover and we don't remember is that more than 10,000 people died between 2014, probably more than that, but that's the number I've seen that can be verified, between 2014 and last year's invasion. This was an active hot war, including, you know, shooting down civilian airlines that clearly traces back to Russian equipment and Russian allies. Again, people were like, oh my God, what are we going to do? And, you know, Ukraine became a political issue because, I mean, you can't make this up. Paul Manafort, the guy who ran Trump's campaign, was working for an oligarch in Ukraine to basically, you know, overturn the Ukrainian government to install a Russian, you know, proxy after the Russian president had been thrown out of Ukraine. I mean, you can't make it up. So Manafort's working for Deripaska, who's basically working for Putin. And then, you know, Trump, whether he's told by an American, he's told by a Russian, whoever tells him, decides that Ukraine is a great way to leverage against Democrats and against, you know, Putin eventually. And we get into the first impeachment and on it goes. So here's what I think Putin thought. We know from reports coming out of the Trump White House, mostly from John Bolton, that Trump intended to pull the United States out of NATO if he got reelected. So if you're Putin and you're thinking, you know, I'm going to take Ukraine. Ukraine is strategic. Ukraine has not just huge agricultural assets, industrial assets. It has rare earth minerals. It has mineral assets that we need for the new economy. I'm taking it. But let's just wait. If Trump wins, he's going to do it for me because he'll pull the U.S. out of NATO, and I'm fine. So then, you know, news alert, Trump loses. And so Putin goes, okay, what am I going to do now? I still want Ukraine. I need Ukraine. If I'm going to reconstruct, you know, my version of the Russian Empire. And you know what? I think Biden is really wounded. I think post-Trump, America's playing a weak hand. Europe is never going to stand up to me. The U.S. is divided. They're not going to do much about it. And oh my God, look what they just did in Afghanistan. So, hey, let's get ready. And I think that was, pretty much the calculation. And because he is in a dictatorial, role, he only heard what he wanted to hear from anybody who reported to him, whether they were military or intelligence or security reports, that it would be an easy task. You'd invade from both Belarus and from the east, and bang, you would have Ukraine. So that to me is kind of the very short version of what he was thinking. And I think we've learned a lot. And I think Madeleine was right. I think this has been a terrible mistake for Putin and Russia. The issue is whether we have the staying power to really make it stick. Because what have we learned? We've learned, number one, that, hey, guess what? The Biden administration did a heck of a good job uniting Europe against Russia. And it was really difficult, but it wasn't just in terms of military equipment. It was in terms of sanctions. I mean, we had the United States basically saying to our European allies, this is hard, but you have to join us in these sanctions, which means Germany and Eastern Europe, you're not going to get your energy from Russia anymore. We have to make them bite. And they did it. And they did it in a way that people did not think when it started was possible. So the military equipment, the sanctions, and it's not just Europe, South Korea, Japan, Australia, others have been helping. So Putin woke up and the world pretty much was united against him. That was the one thing, big mistake. The second thing, which I think is really important, I think we learned Putin's military was a fraud. We learned that Putin's military was not at all equal to the task. They were poorly trained, they were poorly equipped, and they were really poorly led. And what they have done is to take massive casualties without any regard for human life, throwing body after body against, targets like Bakhmut. And so the threat, the fear of this massive Russian military was diminished. That was a mistake for Putin. Third big mistake, I think, is remember he went to China before he invaded, and she was like, oh, we're going to do anything we can to help you, because she was also being told by Putin, it's a cakewalk. I'll be in Kyiv in a week. We will get rid of the existing government. We'll install a government that is favorable to us. No worries. Well, she watches, this happen, this unfold. It doesn't go like that at all. And I was one of those who believed that she was probably looking at moving against Taiwan, whether it was cyber, blockade, invasion, whatever the choice was going to be, moving against Taiwan because he was explicit that he was going to solve the Taiwan problem. And all of a sudden he goes, oh my gosh, wait a minute. I got to take a deep breath here. I got to see how this plays out. So I actually think that Putin's problems in Ukraine have influenced Xi with respect to timing and approach to Taiwan, which is also good for us. And the final thing is there is a lot of backbiting and internal conflict going on within the military, between the military and what's called Wagner's army, run by this guy Prigozhin, who emptied the prisons to basically send these convicts to their death. I mean, this may be an exaggeration. It sounds like one to me. But I have read credible sources which say that Russia has lost 100,000 men in Ukraine, more, and probably more than that. So I think, Madeleine was a very clear-eyed observer of Putin. She didn't meet him all that often because he didn't really come into power until she had left. But I met him a lot, and she and I would talk about him because she had a very ongoing interest in Russia thinking and Russia actions, and she spoke Russian and she studied Russian, so she was an expert in it. So I think, Fritz, that Madeleine saw that if we didn't blink, if we stayed the course, if our European friends would also, stand with Ukraine, that the dominoes would not fall, to use that old metaphor. Because there's no doubt, if you talk to a Latvian, an Estonian, a Lithuanian, a Pole, a Moldovan, a Finn, if you talk to any of those people who are on the borders and have had experience with Russia in the past, there is no doubt they saw Ukraine as the opening gambit, not the end, but the opening. So let's hope we stay the course. Let's hope that the counteroffensive, whenever, wherever, however it unfolds, pushes the Russians back. People ask me all the time, how's it going to end? I don't know, because you know what? It's not our business as to how it's going to end. It's the Ukrainians' business. If they push Russia out of the territory that they seized since last February, is that a point at which they stop? I don't think so. I think the Ukrainians are now committed to pushing them out of Crimea and pushing them out of all of Ukraine. So we have a ways to go on this, and it's really, really important. Ukrainians win, Russians lose.
Now, we are pretty much at time, and I get myself in big trouble if we get, although I'd love to pursue that and other questions with you. Such a marvelous opportunity to talk with you. It is a fascinating sort of somehow that in this moment, Madeleine's background, her history has come alive again, right? That family story, that history is so relevant to this moment again, and somehow seems very fitting that we end talking on that question.
I think that's a really important endpoint. If you've never lost freedom, if you've never had to flee before soldiers wearing the uniform of a foreign country invade your homeland, if you've never watched the subversion of your democracy and the takeover of your country by a foreign power, as Madeleine saw all of that, lived all of that, it might be a little difficult to really imagine what's at stake. And I think that's what Americans today need to really understand. And Madeleine is a great guide to that, because a lot of what's happening in our country right now, the rollback of voting rights, the attack on institutions, including literally an attack on our Capitol, people who think violence is the answer to disagreements that should be debated and discussed and voted on instead. We don't have that lived experience that Madeleine Albright had. So we have to imagine what it would mean to start losing our freedoms one by one, and to have leaders who felt unaccountable to any institution or the rule of law. And we sadly right now in America have some leaders who think the better way to govern is by dictate, tell people what they have to do, hold them, to account if they don't do what you tell them to do. And it's a really important moment in American history to try to incorporate the lessons of the past and learn from them. We can have our disagreements. My gosh, that's the American way. We can disagree about all of the issues and how we're supposed to think about them and how we're supposed to address them. But when you have leaders who ban books, who are trying to tell you what you can say, who tell major corporations that I don't like what you're doing, so I'm going to try to destroy you, that is from the past. We've seen this play before in other places. We are not immune from it. And the saddest thing to me right now is what's happened to the Republican Party. I was in the Senate for 8 years. I worked with practically every Republican senator on something. I crossed the aisle. I found principal compromise. We hammered out legislation. So I know a lot of the people who are still there. And I know they know better than to allow this to go on. And they are twisting themselves in rhetorical pretzels instead of standing up and saying, no, he did not win. There were 60 lawsuits. He had no evidence. And guess what? We still believe in facts and evidence. Now, we're sorry he didn't win, but he didn't win. Let's get on with it. And the number of people willing to say that is too few. Or, after the immediate fear and outrage with being invaded by our own people at our Capitol and fleeing for your life from the House and the Senate, we've seen the videos. And people in the immediate aftermath saying how horrible it was and how we have to, figure out how to prevent something like this from happening again. Now, they were tourists. I mean, you can't make this up. And it is Orwellian. It is twisting language to fit a political agenda that is not connected to truth and fact. And you can have all the disagreements in the world. And I'm in the middle of a lot of them because I believe certain things. Other people of good faith believe something else. Let's figure out if there's common ground or not. But what's happening, unfortunately, in too many places right now is not that kind of politics, but an authoritarian mindset. You either believe what I believe or you don't count. You either do what I want you to do or you're not included. And that's what we have to learn from Madeleine. She warned us, and those warnings should lead every one of us, regardless of what political party we are part of, to do everything we can to make sure we elect leaders who respect democracy and who are willing to let people vote and count every vote and live by the consequences of that. That's what I think Madeleine would want us to do.
And thank you so much for sharing those thoughts and all the thoughts this evening. Certainly this quality of discourse that we see now is a central issue for us at the Korbel School at the University of Denver. We're doing what we can to promote civil discourse, conversations across the aisle, fact-based, evidence-based policy. So we're all, I think, in this together on that front. Let me obviously thank you again for this evening, and thank you for whether one agrees with everything the Secretary believes, as you say, we can disagree. But an extraordinary life of public service. I mean, from you, I believe you first kind of emerged in public consciousness from your graduation speech at Wellesley College a couple of years ago. And over that time you served in the Watergate commissions. We know the rest of the biography, years in Arkansas, obviously, and years in the White House, your time as a senator, your time as Secretary of State, and of course in the political campaigns, and as being a public figure for an extraordinary time. So please join me in thanking Secretary Clinton for tonight, but for a life of remarkable public service. We are, yeah, we'll just sit for a minute, yeah. Unless you want to stand, yeah. Now we have one more important thing to do this evening, and that's the presentation of the Joseph Korbel Award. And Secretary Clinton, I'm delighted if you would join me in presenting this award this evening. Let me just say a word about the award. The Korbel Award we've given for many years now to quite an array of really impressive people. It's given to outstanding individuals who embody the values of the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies and have committed their lives to creating a more secure, equitable, just, democratic, and sustainable world. It is impossible to think of an awardee who more exemplifies the values of Joseph Korbel and of the school named for him than Secretary Madeleine Korbel Albright herself. That tiny giant of American foreign policy, pioneer and mentor for succeeding generations of women in international affairs, embodiment of the promise of America, inspiration for democracy's defenders around the world. So on behalf of the Joseph Korbel School, it will be our honor to present the Joseph Korbel Award this evening to Madeleine Albright in memoriam. And accepting, on Secretary Albright's behalf and representing her Aunt Kathy, her Uncle John, her sisters Ann and Katie, and the entire Korbel Albright family, is Alice Albright. Alice, please join us.